discourse will be useful for so many other pieces.
Well, I think the thing that's most interesting about like that 40-year period is is it considered post-industrial, right? So I think you have to think about the parents of that generation, right?
Right.
And that
boomer parents, Gen Xer parents.
Yeah. And that on the earlier end of it, what year were your parents born?
My mom, 1950, my dad probably like 49.
So the older end of the millennial crowd has parents that went through the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a certain amount of trauma that then gets passed on a child from going through secondary school, desegregating. And I don't think we talk about how that manifested in our own childhoods, being children of parents who were the children who had to desegregate schools, and primarily being the children of those parents who didn't see the promised returns from that desegregation. Like my father, who was born in 52, has a very negative outlook on being forced to desegregate and what that meant for his own childhood and the losses that came with that. There's actually a This American Life episode with Shasir Zamata.
I know who that is.
Her mom about desegregating schools.
I don't know why I thought she was African.
No, I thought so too, but her mom turns out Southern African American, at least. And so it's actually a really, really good episode. I think even though This American Life is obviously edited for a wide audience, and so I think there were some points where I heard it because I'm a child of one of those people.
Right.
I think you have to listen with
you catch those Negro dog whistles.
Yeah. So on the other end, and then I think the middle spectrum, like my mom was born in 1961. And so even though she's considered a boomer, the later boomers are like the Kamala Harrises. No, we didn't get the Kamala Harris, our parents didn't make it up to the upper echelon of society necessarily, but that was the first generation to go through an education system that was fully desegregated. And they were the first post-civil rights generation. Yeah. So was that technically that's Gen X?
So 61 might still be boom. So how is
it is still boomer, but she's in the
61. How old would you be? 50 something?
We don't celebrate birthdays. This is not really hard.
40. Let's see. It's 61 will be. 60. Okay, so no, that's still. I'm pretty sure that's still a boomer. That's like the last boomers because the Xers are in their early 40s to like mid to late 50s.
I think there was actually an article on NPR about when it comes to Kamala Harris, who did it? NPR's, what's their Black podcast with Gene Demby? Code Switch.
Okay,
did an episode on Kamala Harris during the election and they specifically talk about, from like a political perspective, her generation of Blacks. So, but without like naming the generation, my mom is also from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So my mother is part of that era that I think of when I listen to like things about Kamala Harris, where you are coming of age with the representational politics in effect, right? Yeah. So you are growing up in cities with Black mayors, Black policemen,
That's where Black excellence kind of gets its. So like the myth of Black excellence, which, I argue that Obama made the myth come true on accident, right? Like it was never supposed to actually happen. And then like it happened. And then I look at like our generation, we saw that as we're entering adulthood. And I think a lot of us like bought in like, oh, it's like that. And I think a lot of us are now coming back out of that saying, maybe that was an anomaly and that this isn't the way we should be going. And I think that's reflected in our parentage. I think it was, if you're like me, right, you had, relatively educated parents who had access on some level. We're talking about a specific economic status of Black youth, right? Because I'm not talking about my cousins who grew up in the Wild Hundreds. You know what I'm saying? I'm talking about my other cousins who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago like me. And so our parents were the parents of, you get straight A's. Yeah, you going to college or you getting out my house. You got to be twice as good to get half as much, so on and so forth. Like that was our parentage. And what you're saying is that's because some of them either were like in the middle of that civil rights moment, and so they don't have no compassion for our emotional response to that type of pressure, or some of them grew up post that moment and see the trajectory that you could have if you have the talent and work ethic.
Actually a way to like package what type of Black millennial you are based on where your parents fell within that desegregation movement, right? So I'm kind of in the middle because I had a father from the South who was older, who grew up going through the desegregation, and then a mother from the North who grew up in sort of this very like, you know, pro-Black era.
Yeah.
And I also see that I think generally though, we all grew up with this understanding that education was our ticket out.
Right.
And what the Obama era proved, it's not even the Obama era, what the post-Obama era proved was how thorough the American system is in keeping us disenfranchised.
Yeah.
And so now we've had to, you know, rethink about what are the systems in play that keep us oppressed, because we've had the representation, we've done the education, you know, we've done the Black excellence, we've gotten to the White House.
Yeah.
And we're still economically, we're like at, you know, then not even before we get to the pandemic, we got a recession, we got, you know, Trump, we got a lot of things got more expensive. And then on top of that, you get the pandemic.
Right. And then you see our movements getting co-opted. You see the same stuff that was happening under Obama is now even more in your face. So you have George Floyd, Breonna Taylor.
And now all of a sudden we're talking about the history of that, like, you know, that era that our parents grew up with under the Warren Supreme Court. So you have all these big progressive laws passing, and that was the anomaly. The anomaly, I don't even think Obama was the anomaly. I think the anomaly really was the Warren Court era that preceded our generation, that then was like, go out and be twice as good because you have an opportunity that no other generation before you has.
Right.
But we were coming up in an era where like the white political class, not even the white Christian, white evangelical Christian, Jimmy Carter included, were working to dismantle.
Right. All of that shit
over the long game.
Yeah, you know this.
I was born in '85, so like I personally do not remember a lot of the '80s.
Right.
But from a historical perspective, what is unique about the '80s is because it's historical, I'm going to go political. Is the Reagan era. And coming out of this Wall Street era, and you really are like, you're deep in the representational politics, and I actually think that like a lot of the things and discourse we're having around like Black wealth and wealth aesthetics and capitalism, I think it would be great if people had a better historical understanding or memory of like the 80s. Because it's also the rise of the crack epidemic. Right. You know what I mean? Like we see, like you see this stratification happens, and I don't know if we really tap into it because the stratification always existed for the Black community. But we see like the small class of, I think you can understand the difference based on did your parents go to college? Mm-hmm. If you were born in the 80s and you are the child of the Black college educated parent, you are a very privileged person. Mm-hmm. What did it mean to get to college in the 70s and 60s?
That's how I start this paper. I start that out. I was born in Chicago in the 80s to two college graduate Black folks. My whole, not just life trajectory, but even the things I experienced as a kid compared to my cousins who weren't like in the streets, their parents weren't in the streets, but because they had to grow up in the wild hundreds in the 80s during the crack epidemic, whole different opportunity structure. And you think about how a show like The Cosby Show was on TV during the crack epidemic and you would never know from that show. You know what I'm saying? Which says a lot about the politics of Cosby, aside from his other issues, that he had the biggest show on TV in the middle of the 80s, in the middle of the crack epidemic, in these Black areas in New York, where he was, you know, where the story took place. And it doesn't get touched on at all. There's no very special episode of The Cosby Show.
He has, you know, because, you know, I also grew up on Fat Albert. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I think Cosby, as a purveyor of television and media, really has a huge influence on our memory of the Black community, in that there is this sort of line drawn where it's the Black college educated, the Black upper echelon who focused on education, did the right things, became the right kind of people, and then the lower class, the welfare, the crack epidemic, the public housing people, because this is also the era. It's not, the 80s actually isn't the era of welfare. The welfare movement, there was a welfare movement that came out of the civil rights movement, because the third tier, right before MLK was murdered, his last speech was about economic civil rights, about the protesting to be about economic and labor rights. And so out of that came like a welfare rights movement that there's a whole history to why that went left, because men took it over, but to push back against tier 2, because see, I want to break down the whole history of welfare.
We can't do it.
I'm not going to go back to 1924, but there's 2 tiers to welfare, right? Our pensions, unemployment, Medicaid, disability are all welfare, but they're seen mostly as earned welfare, that you worked or something happened to you and you were the perfect kind of victim, or you were the perfect kind of worker and you earned those rights. Right. And then tier 2, public housing, aid to dependent children, food stamps, WIC, all those things are seen as dependent.
And you're the wrong type of person.
Yeah, but you
don't deserve that.
Structured based on how the law came about. The New Deal was structured in 1924, and the southern states wanting to keep Black women's labor in their control. And so in the 1970s,
it wasn't to destroy the Black family and disempower Black men.
Yeah, you know what? In the book club that I'm literally reading a book about that right now for my book club. But
let me. You might have to shoot me what's the title of that? Because I am gonna circle back to this Black manosphere shit.